So good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest in our webinars on enterprise private networking, LTE, 5G, etc. Today, we're going to be talking, the title is Lease or Buy, the economics of enterprise private LTE network deployment, which is a very big subject. It's probably the most common question we get in the questions that people submit at these is how much does it cost to build a network? And the answer to that, of course, is how long is a piece of string? There's a lot of components that go into it, and we're going to talk about those today and get through that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just go through a few of the logistics, introduce the speakers, kick things off, and then we'll get into the content pretty quickly here. So a couple of housekeeping things are being recorded today. We will send out details of the recording after the event. If you have any questions, we will be taking questions. We'll either work them in as we go through today, or we will just take them at the end. But if you look on the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions tab there, and you can just type in the questions. We'll deal with them as we go. We'll also make the slides available. They'll be available with the recording afterwards as well. Speakers today, as you can see the videos here, and you're probably looking at those three guys in the videos thinking, wow, they really photoshopped those photos there to make them look good. Tormod Larsen is CTO for Externet. He's the one looking very serious there, and he's the one with the clock behind his head. Jim Jacobellis from Geoverse is VP of Solutions and Business Partners. He's on the bottom there, and Todd Landry is doing his Western impression today with his shirt, and he's at an undisclosed location today. We can't talk about where he is. He's hiding away. Todd, of course, is Senior VP for JMA Wireless. So we're going to go through this. What we're going to do for agenda is I'm going to ask each of the speakers just to introduce their company, what they do. Then we'll go through each of these different sections, and each of the speakers will talk for a few minutes in each one. So we'll talk about what drives that enterprise private networking cost. What are those components that go into it? A lot of people think it's just the radio, it's just the wiring. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously. What are the deployment options? We'll talk about infrastructure as a service and some of the different deployments, some things that go in the cloud, etc. A little bit we'll get into a discussion more about how do the cost of the different networks compare and what goes into that discussion. As I said, it's the most universal question we get, but it's a very difficult one to answer because of the variations between networks. And then wrap it up with some of the fundamentals of the cost versus the benefit. Sometimes, if most things, the cheapest solution may not be the best value, depending on what you're trying to do. I'll wrap it up, then we'll take the Q&A. Okay, so with that, I am going to set the stage here. This is a diagram I've shown a lot. I'd just like to set the stage of, you can look at this as a city here with lots of connections. But you can see we've got some private networks around manufacturing and transportation, Class A commercial space, the stadium there. We've got some networking around the home. But on this one, I'll just draw attention to some of the applications you see. There's a big variation in applications you may want to deploy in different places. It may be IoT, tracking of things, or it may be something very sophisticated like connecting let's say an ambulance to the emergency room with a high definition, low latency, secured, guaranteed connection. The cost of providing those two extremes is going to be very different. So what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish, not just now, but looking forward, becomes very important here. Obviously, we won't go through all of these, but the costs, again, this is why we get this question is, what does it cost? It's going to vary. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Tormod. Tormod, you've got a few minutes here. Who is Externet and what do you guys do?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I appreciate the opportunity here. So Externet is the largest pure play provider of small cell networks, indoor and outdoor. throughout the US. We've actually been doing this for quite some time. I was founded back in 2002. As you can see on the slide, we're pretty much all over the US with networks, like I said, both indoor and outdoor. And behind us, we have a number of long-term digital infrastructure investors. Our business is to invest and fund in these networks and run them as a service to our customers. You can just go to the next one. We're in a number of large buildings like the Empire State Building. We have large outdoor networks in major metropolitan markets. We have about 600 networks and about 30,000 nodes nationally. And obviously, private 5G is a great opportunity for us to layer in additional capabilities on our networks. Our networks is about shared infrastructure. So we serve traditionally the major carriers, but more and more we also see building owners and enterprises being our customers. And with private 5G, we think that's a great opportunity for them to, in addition to provide the traditional cell phone service, also get into what you mentioned, IoT, building management systems, and those type of things. So from an infrastructure perspective, really excited about the opportunity.
Okay, great. And I noticed you've gone to the big three operators there, because of course Sprint now is part of T-Mobile, so I know you moved the logo there. Okay, Jim, Geoverse with the fancy building slide here. It's your new slide. Who are you? What do you do?
Thanks, Ian. Happy that you noticed. Yeah, some background on Geoverse. We are kind of the lead of U.S. operations for a publicly traded company by the name of ATN International. They're a telecom holding company, lots of different assets, mainly in the telecom or alternate energy domain, but we're a cellular carrier in many countries, and in the U.S., we're the largest wholesale roaming operator. We provide kind of wholesale roaming to all the major carriers and some other carriers in a good swath of the Western United States. So our value, I guess, to the CBRS ecosystem is that we enable some of those carrier-like performance characteristics on a CBRS network. So some functionality like roaming, like the ability to do VoLTE, the ability to have true technical support from folks that are experienced with LTE, a NOC to support your CBRS deployments, that from folks that are familiar with LTE. And we work both directly with enterprises, but majority of the time we're working with a partner who uses our resources to complete what they need to complete with the enterprise.
Okay, great. And Todd, who is JMA? What do you guys do?
Yes, thanks, Ian, and hello, everybody. So JMA has a long history in the area of building passive network equipment, evolved over the years into the world of building the leading distributed antenna system deployed in many places of the world. Over the past 4 to 5 years, we then evolved heavily into the area of both 4G and 5G virtualized RAN technology. So you can see in here, as of now, we've built a very large plant in upstate New York, where we'll be demonstrating there and manufacturing actually in the US some of the latest 5G millimeter wave technology and some of the latest private wireless radio technology. We primarily been focusing heavily on evolving our software side of the development business. So a lot of the focus here in private wireless technology that we'll talk about today, but also a lot of focus in the breadth of 5G technology across the full range of spectrum. So largely the vendor of that core technology, working with many partners like Extenet and Geoverse on the call with us today.
Okay, great. And you and I were talking before the call started. My parents actually live in Ithaca, New York, just down the road from Syracuse. So next time I go see him, I'll stop by. You can give me all those demos. So.
It's a must visit, absolutely.
Okay, so Todd, I want to come back to you, and let's start this discussion here with, let's start a discussion about the components that go into the cost equation, right? What are all the pieces I'm going to need for this network here, and where do they all fit? So let's start that discussion.
Yeah, a lot of times, specifically as you talk about, deploying a private network within an enterprise, you don't realize that when you're dealing with a LTE technology, you're going to end up with all the components of a mobile network. They might be, more efficient, like Todd mentioned, they're deploying stuff in software, and it reduce some of the maybe cost and complexity of deploying it. But a lot of times, the focus is on exactly those components you're deploying. So like you mentioned earlier, you need a RAN, you have the wiring, the backbone infrastructure to connect the RAN, you have the core, the EPC, and obviously that you need a system to operate that. And then, and I think some of my colleagues here will go through a little bit also on the device and SIM cards and applications that are going to ride on the network, because unlike in Wi-Fi, those devices that are going to be on a network need to be authenticated on a network, and they need a SIM card, either that being traditional hard SIM cards or soft SIM cards, but they still need to be both deployed in the devices, but also managed. So, a big portion of deploying these networks is actually the integration, and then after you start using it, somebody needs to operate it. And a lot of enterprises and building owners are not really set up for it, right? So that's where, and another element of CBRS is you also need a spectrum allocation service that are allocating the spectrum and providing that to you. And all of that need to be coordinated. And then you have elements of, like, even the EPC, some of the private deployments, are that sitting in the cloud or is it on-prem? Because, if you are running a manufacturing plant off it, you don't want to rely on your transport out of the building. You most probably want it on-prem, and it's more closer to real-time applications. You have digital signage in a building, not as critical from neither a timing perspective or from a transport perspective. So you need to look at some of those components, not only which components you have, but where are they located? What could be located, on-prem? What could be located, in the cloud? But the biggest part here, for the way I look at it, specifically as you're getting into this as a non-operator perspective, is how do you choose the right partner to help you, or partners to help you accommodate what you try to do. And that's what you kind of see in the middle here, is all these applications that you're going after. That's where I think a lot of the enterprises should focus, and then bringing some experts to help you with the components and making sure that they are working together and operating the way you want over time.
Right. Okay. Great. So Jim, Tom kind of gave you a nice introduction there. He was talking about the RAN and some of those different components. Looking more better on the back end here, the EPC, the SIM, all those types of things. Where does that fit in for you guys?
Yeah, so I kind of broke kind of components or costs down into two buckets. One of them being the network itself, and what do you need in order to enable a private LTE network? Well, the first thing you need, and it's probably the most important, and for the first time in the history of the United States, we have access to not only spectrum, but prime 150 megahertz of LTE spectrum that any enterprise can use for free. That spectrum is also migratable to 5G if you do your planning right. So to me, that's the most important element. And so how do you take advantage of that? What do you do with it? Well, you know, the other cost element, or the, you know, second component is the RAN layer. Now, I'm not sure if you're paying attention, Todd, but you may notice the brand of the RAN there that I included. So the RAN is kind of something that we in the industry call it. It's kind of the radio layer, but it's very confusing because certain companies call it a CBSD in the CBRS world. Others call it an access point. Others just call it a small cell, but it's the radio layer, and that is definitely a component. It's a cost element. And the third kind of component and cost element is the EPC, or the core. And I think Torm had indicated that that component can either be kind of dedicated to an individual enterprise, maybe located on-prem or in one of their data centers. It can be located in a shared cloud environment, back in a data center that somebody else owns and manages. But it's definitely a cost component and an element of it. And then the other kind of element that not a lot of people talk about is the management, the analytics, you know, and the support that goes along with it. And the cool thing, one of the cool things about CBRS is that the enterprise now gets control of that data, where if you are relying on, you know, you're just bringing an operator signal inside that building, CBRS gives you the opportunity to own and control and get visibility down to a device level as to what's going on in your building. And so that was not previously available before, even if you had a VPN connection. So the next kind of component or cost element is the applications that's on the next slide. And I put a potpourri of kind of what I see as the kind of currently some of the most common applications out there, whether it be, you know, just lighting up a remote surveillance camera, enabling Wi-Fi hotspot. Kind of the new popular one is mobile health systems. You know, you're checking people as they come in and out of buildings, making sure they don't have temperature or other issues. That's a new one. Robotics, phones, walkie-talkies, point of sales, electronic signage, all that kind of stuff is going on right now with CBRS. It's obviously a cost element for you know, for the devices and, you know, some of the other network support. But you know, the common theme there is, you know, CBRS private LTE is being used as a fiber or high-speed Ethernet alternative, and even a Wi-Fi alternative for, you know, IT extensions, voice mobility, and that sort of thing. And you know, it is you know, growing and growing in popularity. Now, I know you wanted to cover payment options, and that's kind of the narrative here. So you're probably not going to like this answer, but I've seen anything goes for payments, from full subscription for everything from handsets to the network, to other elements, to full CapEx, to something in between. And I think if an enterprise wants a CBRS network, there's a number of companies that are willing to provide the right financial model to accommodate them. That's how I see it right now.
So just to kind of dive on that a little bit then. So the enterprise doesn't necessarily have to buy everything with CapEx up front. You can do some managed services. You can do some, you know, longer term payback lease type options as well. You've seen those types of variations?
Yeah, I mean, from zero down, all subscription, to something that I was going to talk about later that JMA and Geoverse have developed together, where you know, you get into a deferred payment model. And there's all kinds of models out there. There's even models where the enterprise is looking for a carrier subsidy just using CBRS. And I don't want to go down various rabbit holes right now, but an enterprise loves CBRS, somebody will find a way to accommodate them.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like buying a Ford F-150. You can lease it, you can pay up front, you can get a 3-year loan, a 7-year loan, you can defer your payments for 6 months.
Yeah, you just don't get Spectrum with the F-150.
That's true, that's true. So, all right, Todd, again, Tormod gave you a little introduction here. He was talking about all the partners and all the pieces you need here. And this is a very big slide, but I think it does a really good job of talking about the ecosystem of partners that are needed here. So you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, and I think they accurately highlighted some of the things that are necessary to actually operate a network inside of an enterprise. And we'll talk a little bit later about how do you kind of break those down into areas to think about. This slide talks a little bit about our history, and what's important here is that over the years, and especially now in the past year and a half, 2 years, we've touched a lot of different enterprises and specifically vertical industry sectors, and have learned a ton about the different use cases that Jim has been highlighting. And to deliver, of course, we need really partner networks. So for us, we don't go and offer a service or sell our equipment directly to the enterprise. We enable a partner network like Extenet, like Geoverse. Now, it is new technology, right? So a lot of the partners that have been in our network before were operators of RF systems and are evolving more towards some of the components highlighted in Tormod's chart and in Jim's chart, whereby you have to learn more about EPCs and have to have a plan and a strategy for operating kind of that part of the network. And then you need to add to that the eNode B function or the RAN type function. What's important here is the experience from touching a lot of enterprises, because at the end of the day, what we're doing to get value, if we come back to the topic, it's a question of what am I trying to achieve with this? And I think in most engagements that we've been engaged in with partners like my colleagues here on the call, what we're finding with CBRS is a lot of the enterprises are looking at it initially, and some all the way back to the level of what do I use it for? Some have a basic idea and they think of it as a mobile phone technology, but invariably, most of the engagements going on in the marketplace today are starting with very unique use cases, enabling automatic guided vehicles, enabling a better comms at a construction site, enabling unique connectivity using this pervasive and secure technology called CBRS. And the last thing I'll say about it in the finding here is that, you know, a lot of times we will talk about it because it's wireless technology and want to contrast it to Wi-Fi or contrast it to licensed cellular. And I always remind people, most often what CBRS is competing with is actually the wires, right? Not either those other adjacent wireless technologies, because there's enough room in the demand for the different spectrum, and they each have their own unique characteristics in terms of where you can terminate the data flows, what kind of services that you can deliver with it, what kind of characteristics the wireless provides. So this is really a chunk of new highway that you can use very differently than what you can use the other wireless technologies for.
Yeah, it's a good point. We often forget that, you know, we obviously got Wi-Fi and licensed options, but that wired is still, there's a lot of wire out there. And,
there's still a lot of wire out there, believe it or not.
Yeah, actually, I think it was Jim on the previous slide. He had the application there with the temperature sensors as you walk into a building. We had an integrator on one of the last series of webinars we did, and they were talking about that application. And actually, that started because they didn't want to run an Ethernet to that what do you call it, trolley, right? It has to move. And so CBRS came in for that. It's one of the applications, which is interesting. So it replaces the wire. So, all right, Tormod, back to you here. Let's dive into these business models. You hinted at it earlier. And you're talking here about infrastructure as a service. So go on mute, Tormod. There you go.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that. So as Tim mentioned, is a number of models out there. What we see, and this is an example of infrastructure as service, and actually to a building owner. There's a lot of talk about the enterprises, but a lot of specifically in multi-tenant buildings, the enterprise itself might not be set up to invest into a private 5G. However, the building owner actually is very incentive to have a network that is both independent of the wireless carrier public networks, as well as the Wi-Fi networks that the enterprise and the tenants are providing. So things like you just mentioned, either temperature scanners, facial recognition, building management system, digital signage. You mentioned kind of replacing cable. We see a lot of flex space, temporary space, internet connections. Instead of wiring it up and doing all of the IT planning around it, you could basically use private LTE to provide temporary internet within the space. So a number of those type of applications. So infrastructure as a service model, and what this illustration is conveying is you could have the building owner as basically getting the infrastructure as service. They are more in tune with all these applications based on who they are and their tenants. They could work with the tenants and include that either as part of the rent or the common area maintenance charges. We jointly work with different service providers that might want to have access to this network. And, building management is a good example, but there's other aspects of that, and even more traditional MNOs. So that's kind of creating an ecosystem from a business perspective. Actually, our CEO, he said, look, the real IoT is the infrastructure of things, and you start with kind of getting that infrastructure in. Now it's limitless what you could actually connect to it, but Internet of Things without that infrastructure doesn't really there. So that's one aspect of it, and maybe you could just go to the next slide. When we talk about cost, we don't look at private 5G as have to carry the entire burden of the cost. A big part of the cost of deploying these networks is in the wiring and the backbone and some of the common infrastructure. That could be leveraged also for more traditional public 4G and 5G. So when we talk about CBRS specifically, and people talk about the ability to neutral host on that spectrum, yes, 150 megahertz of spectrum, but in a 5G context, that's not that much. We have carriers today that are deploying 800 megahertz. So we're thinking about layering in, private 5G, having, licensed spectrum on that same infrastructure. Based on what the building is, you could kind of flex there. And then, it's a lot of wires to make things wireless. Since we had a conversation about wires, that infrastructure could be used for a lot of other things as well. And that way, you're really creating a shared infrastructure that could be leveraged in a much broader way. And specifically, as you're working with real estate owners, this is digital real estate, right? This is how we manage that. So that's just another aspect of how we're looking at, even from a business model perspective, it's not only about the private 5G, it's what other stuff that we could complement with in terms of the investments as well.
Okay, great, and we'll come back to that. And as a reminder, if anybody has any questions, just use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. I've got a few here actually that were submitted beforehand. We'll get to at the end, but we can work them in or talk about it as we finish the presentation. So Jim, costs here, total cost of ownership. You want to walk through this one?
Yeah, so as a CBRS Alliance member and participant, one of the things that I was involved in was a cost analysis that was done by mobile experts comparing the cost of OnGo or CBRS with Wi-Fi and DAS. So this report is a little bit over a year old, and the driver for this was a good percentage of the enterprise community, what you may call the middle prize or what you may call the unwanted, can't afford DAS. And so Mobile Experts was assigned to look at this as, okay, how do we, what costs can we come up with, and how do we use CBRS to unlock this middle prize kind of set of enterprises, if you will. And, as you can see here, the costs are, significantly less than DAS, even though you have components like EPC and other things in here that you might not have with DAS. But because, even now we're at a state where only 15% of the smartphones approximately are able to talk on a CBRS network. So enabling multi-operator BYOD cellular is still only, even if we had everything working fine, would only apply to 15% of the folks. So how do you use this now? You basically come up with a financial incentive so that folks that invest in a CBRS network can use it now for private LTE, and then kind of work their way into using it for CBRS neutral host or multi-operator cellular when more and more devices come into play. And so, as I mentioned earlier, JMA and Geoverse and some other partners have created a model that will kind of let that happen. And I think Todd gave it a name that he changes every day. But Todd, I don't know if you can hear me. What's your name du jour for this?
Oh, I think we got to save that for some exciting announcement around.
But in summarize, I mean, the idea is that CBRS can not only enable all this great private LTE stuff, but it will and it can enable this BYOD multi-operator cellular experience. Now, it may just be an adjunct to DAS in a lot of places, but for a certain subsection of the enterprise, I think it unlocks this opportunity, and that subsection of the enterprise happens to be the vast majority of enterprises across the United States.
So Jim, obviously this slide is, as I said at the beginning, a lot of people ask this question. So do you remember roughly what size building, what type of building they were looking at here? Because obviously you get a variation if it's
it was approximately a 250,000 square foot office building. I can't remember the number of floors, but it was for an office environment that the study was done around. And we tried to take into consideration a variety of RAN options, because there are certainly all over the board what the cost of the RAN would be, and so this is kind of the middle ground for that. And obviously DAS has this, you can go all over the place with DAS, so had to take a middle ground approach.
Right. So this is I look at this as kind of a comparative rather than absolute. Obviously, if you've got a bigger building, your costs, you've got more efficiency. If you've got a smaller building, you've got some more compromise there. If you're doing a managed option over 5 years versus a lot of CapEx up front, it's going to change things like that, right? Yep. All right, good. So Todd, back over to you. And walking through here the integrators becoming this CBRS operator here of the building, which a couple of people have touched on already.
So a couple things. One is recognizing that there's a lot of new expertise needed in the channel, in the partner network. We developed an enablement program that we're working with all of our partners out there. And what it does is it really zeroes in on all the functional areas end to end and helps collaborate on making the choices and educating and getting certified in the case of our platform in key areas. Now, for integrators out there, what this does is it looks at 8 key areas. And I'll just walk them real quickly. You can kind of see them on the screen here. One, which you heard us really hit on, it's clear understanding of the different type of CBRS devices to enable enterprise use case. So when we start out talking about different use cases of connecting different things, the devices are not mobile phones anymore. They're different types of gateways and Ethernet bridges, and there's a ton of these in the market, and they're growing every day. So you really, as an integrator, need to understand, what are all those devices and how do they get used to match them to a use case inside of an enterprise. Two is an area that, for the most part, our business in the RF space has a lot of good experience at. This includes doing radio frequency designs for a building, to mounting antennas, coax, APs, fiber, etc., and getting that radio infrastructure deployed in a building. And again, there's quite a bit of expertise in there. When you kind of cross that border into area number 3, now you're getting into a function in the network we call an E node B function, or also the baseband. And really understanding this, how to host it, deploy it, commission it, etc., is a critical capability. Now, we have this discussion, and we'll talk more about, is it on-prem or off-prem, but irregardless, you need to have some of that expertise if you're going to offer this to customers. You quickly cross over into point number 4, and you heard mentioned earlier from both Tormod and Jim about the EPC functionality. This is what really gets the packet data from the baseband and the RAN network onto an IP stream, so it's usable by the applications in the network. And the reason I tie that together with the LAN is because when you're going into enterprises, most often you're working with IT personnel. They don't, their expertise is focused in that LAN area, and they have topologies in their local area network to isolate segments, secure different parts of the network, stay connected internally versus externally to different hypercloud applications. You really want to be able to match core functionality and data streams into different LAN segments. So those two really tie a lot together when you get into that space. 5 is about engaging the customer. So obviously, if you have a lot of technology, you need to have an understanding of the capabilities you communicate to the customer. 6 is about having, of course, knowledge in CBRS. There's a capability that you require a CPI or certified professional installer for the SaaS system for CBRS, which you really need to staff. And then we start to get into operations. So 7 is all about all the operational tools and the network operations center, if you're hosting this on behalf of the customer, that you need to have in your bucket. Now, lastly, in this realm is what's called mobile edge computing. And while it's not necessary to build the CBRS plumbing of the network and connect it to some of their existing applications in an enterprise, it's important to keep that in your consideration as an integrator, because this will increase the value. So as you heard earlier, one of the benefits is I can keep the data contained in my private network. Well, what you're going to see as an integrator is an opportunity to then come back into that enterprise and bring in value-added edge applications that can add unique things to that enterprise solution. So these kind of encompass 8 key areas, and we've built an enablement program for partners around this, that any of you out there that are integrators and getting into this business, you're certainly welcome to join us on a webinar. We'll take you through more details on how to take advantage of this. Oh, and a nice flow in.
There you go. So you mentioned on-premise, off-premise. So obviously some of these are in the building, some are always out, some can be either, right?
Yeah, and we could have a good dialogue and debate around this. This is a viewpoint, if you will, using this same chart of these different functions and discussing what has to happen with an enterprise. So when you think about it, the user devices, the UEs as we call them, are always, of course, on premise, because that's where we put the radio frequency, the CBRS radio energy. To put that radio energy in a building, you have to put the antennas and the radio equipment in the building. So inherently, that stuff always ends up on premises in that enterprise. Now, When you go across that border into the baseband, clearly it is an option to have that external of the building and operate it as an off-premise service, but there's a very close relationship between the radio and the baseband, and 99% plus that stuff is going to be on-premise in an enterprise data center. When you look up from there, the connection of the baseband into the SaaS services is by definition a cloud connection. All of the SaaS provided today is via the cloud. And that's inherently, again, the way that's built today. Now, if you go to the right of the baseband into that core function, I think Tormod, you were mentioning, and I know Geoverse, you have the different service offerings today. The core EPC functionality can easily be either all on-premise or in the cloud, or it can be a hybrid, meaning that you can have an element of that core that gets the data and puts it on the local network on premises, and the control layer could be operated in a network like an Extenet or a Geoverse in the core or in the cloud. So that's the point at where these things start to break up. Naturally, if you look at the green to the right of that, I'm going to connect to the LAN somewhere, and if I want a private network and I want to connect devices to my local area network, I got to somehow bridge the green to the green, regardless of where you put the two pieces in the middle, right? So that's the ultimate challenge that we're looking at. In terms of operating a service, all of these options exist, and many of the operators, like these two gentlemen that are out working with end customers today, understand how to position those different options of where to place equipment to benefit the enterprise. And I think that's the key, is that you want the flexibility in your program offering, and you want to be able to map that against how you economize your service offering if you're going to offer an as-a-service profile. So this hopefully gives you a little landscape on different options of what it look like.
Okay. And then the last slide here is the one, and you and I talked about this a couple of days ago, is that, you know, cheapest may not be the best value when you look at what you're trying to do. We don't have to go through all of these, but I thought it was an interesting comparison you've got here.
Yeah, and I think it's important for everybody out there to understand that price can be deduced, or what we call normalized, and looked at in several different ways. And, you know, Jim, I think you hit on this earlier, that if you look at it, the government has provided at no charge a significant amount of spectrum to work with. Now, it isn't the same as some of the millimeter wave technology that's out there, you know, the 400, 800 megahertz, but you can build gigabit capacity connectivity using this spectrum where you need it. And in an IoT world, you actually don't need that much capacity. But the important thing that you do need is you need a platform that has the flexibility to keep monetizing chunks of that spectrum over time. So when you look at the left hand of the spectrum, some systems out there like JMAs are very scalable virtualized RAN applications where all of the connectivity control is in software. It's run in data centers. It can deploy it's very flexible and can deploy in many different ways. The starting price points are, I qualify, in the medium to high range, but when you gotta look at price points at scale, it becomes really low. So at scale means when you really start to use the benefit of all the capabilities of the platform. If you contrast that to other devices in the market, which are very valuable products and have their place, but they tend to be for sometimes what we call small carpet areas. And the starting price points can be very low and or to medium, depending on the product. The issue with them is if you're trying to deploy for multiple use cases in large sites, scale doesn't really exist in that model. So it's very difficult. The other elephant in the room here is this forthcoming 5G capability within CBRS. So you really got to kind of look at it and say, well, if I'm considering that 5G is going to happen, what is my transformation to 5G? And the cost with, you know, more point products is very high because you essentially have to replace them. Whereas with software, it's pretty much a software change, and that cost structure is low. And the only last thing I'd say about this is normalize price based on utilization, such as capacity. You know, if you normalize over number of per sector or per square foot versus just simply APs, you're going to come to some different conclusions. And once we get deep into these kind of discussions with enterprise, I think the realization of how much gain they can get from a system over time sets in, and they start to shift towards a much more flexible system. But both have their merits, and it just really depends on how you kind of look at the numbers.
Okay, great. All right, so just a very quick summary slide here. What we talked about is we talked about the drivers of the costs. Obviously, you've got the radio, the installation, the EPC, the SIM. I put an etc. here, which I think Tormod would say, hey, that's the operations, that's the NOC, that's all the things that people like to forget about that go into actually running the network. We talked about some of the deployment options, infrastructure as a service, integrators becoming CBRS operators. Jim touched on all of the different business models, and I think we said what, Ford F-150 kind of options there, except the Ford doesn't need spectrum, of course.
It doesn't come with a driver either, right?
Doesn't come with a driver, right. And then we talked about the costs vary between different networks, Wi-Fi, DAS, CBRS, on-go. Obviously, there's a wide variation there to the size, application, need, performance, etc. And then finally, Todd obviously talked here about the fundamentals of that cost versus benefit. At the lowest cost may not be the best value. So we do have some time for some questions. I've got some questions actually here that were sent in ahead of time when people registered. If you do have any questions, please use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel here. We've got a few minutes left just to go through some. So I'll start here. So Tormod, I think this is a good one for you. You had a picture of the building with the wires in it. So when you install a system, do you have to put new wires in, fiber, etc., or can you use what's there already?
It's an engineering answer, right? It depends, right? What is the wire that's there, right? And a lot of cases, I would say that we most probably have to at least augment or maybe rewire it, because you know, we like to have fiber as close to that as possible. And a lot of these buildings, you know, it's a lot of Cat6 and other infrastructure, but it depends, right? And so what we'll do an assessment and then leverage the infrastructure we can, and then augment that and make sure that we put in enough wiring so we don't have to go back later on. And out of that being for the next level of, you know, private XT or whatever you're going to be, right? Or for, you know, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of other use cases for that cabling. So we're really looking at that more holistically.
Okay, so, and my next question is going to be on 5G, but when you wire that, if you've got to augment or replace, that future look is going to include scaling it up ready for 5G or higher bandwidth applications, I assume, right?
Correct, and that's what we look at is, and it's interesting the way, you know, for a lot of at least tall and skinny buildings or large buildings, we'll look at, you know, how much fiber and infrastructure we put in the riser. The density as we're going horizontal will vary quite a bit between, you know, traditional 4G frequencies, CBRS, and now with millimeter wave. So we might not have enough density relative on the horizontal, but that's typically also a little bit less expensive. But we'll build it such a way that where we pull cable, we'll have enough fiber strands, we'll have enough capacity to support, you know, 5G and other use cases as well.
Okay, great. So Jim, let's move to 5G. You've got an EPC there. You host it in the cloud. You can put it on premise. I've seen your servers in the demo room there up in Seattle. Obviously, you've got a SIM component here. So as an enterprise moves from LTE into 5G, do they do anything, or are you going to do the work for them?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the kind of the missing element right now. And the thing you put your SIM card in That's the missing element. They're the 5G end user device. I think Todd gave a great answer as to how a radio network might support it, but that's the evolving piece. So yeah, 5G is real exciting. It's a buzzword, but I don't know about you guys, but I have yet to find a use case that you cannot solve with on-premise EPC, CBRS, and a private LTE network. Now that will change as time goes on, but that's kind of my reversing the statement. And I think more folks should be thinking about private LTE with CBRS as a now solution rather than trying to go all in with 5G, because if you're looking for for late because Wi-Fi isn't good enough for latency, maybe CBRS will be. So I'm sorry to spin the question on you, but that's how I'm approaching it.
So maybe it's a private LTE 5GE or something like that, right?
Private 5GE.
Yeah, take some clue from the carriers how they promote it, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's we should be CBRS Alliance should be marketing private LTE, maybe with a 5G element to it.
All right, so we've got a couple of questions here, and I'm going to jump to the one that just came in, because this is the question actually we get quite a bit. And we didn't touch on it today because I think there's an assumption here that everybody knows, and I think we're going to show that it's not. And I'm just going to read the question. The airtime cost is not free. What does a monthly per device cost for GAA? And GAA, for those who don't know, is the general availability for CBRS, that 150 megahertz of spectrum that the government's made available. Actually, there's some auctions next week for the PAL licenses, which are priority access. And I think this is where the confusion comes in. That spectrum is there today, but there's auctions next week. So, Todd, you want to touch on this? Maybe the others jump in there. What does it cost to access CBRS spectrum?
So the cost to access CBRS spectrum is zero. You just got to buy equipment from these three folks on the call, and we'll enable your venue. Now, when I say zero, let's be clear of the terminology. GAA, in the definition of the FCC rules set forth, is arranged so that that spectrum is always available, provided that in the area that you're looking to use it, you get the grant from the SAS system for that chunk of spectrum. And you can get grants and use them in different chunklets or different sizes, depending on how you're using them. Could be as small as 5 megahertz, could be as much as 60 megahertz. We have an auction proceeding right now. That auction is for something called PALs, Priority Access Licenses. Now, in any given county, you could have an individual purchase priority access to up to 40 megahertz of that. The maximum total within a county is 70 megahertz. Okay, so within any given county area or anywhere without other incumbency, you will have at least 80 megahertz in that facility. So that's still a fair amount of spectrum to work with and do things with. The other thing to keep in mind with the way the priority access license is working is, one, it's a use it or lose it kind of model where you can get access and priority rights to access it. It is not like the current license spectrum, meaning that it is not a license such that nobody else can use it. It is a very different kind of license. It's a prioritized access to chunks of spectrum. The last thing about the priority access license is, depending on where your facility is, the priority access license within a county can be licensed or sub-licensed. And one of my colleagues loves to describe that as they buy a provolone cheese for the county, and then they turn it into Swiss cheese by knocking holes in it and sub-licensing it out to facility owners or owners of a campus. So keep that in mind and don't be discouraged by the fact that this PAL license is going on. It actually is probably going to open up opportunity for venue owners to think through how they're going to use all the GAA and how to work with PAL owners on sub-licenses if they need more spectrum. So,
okay. Yeah. No, it's good. I like the analogy. The one I've always heard as well is, imagine Disney was free. Everybody could walk in the front door. But the priority access is that you buy the VIP pass so you can get on the rides first, right? Everybody can go on the ride. You may have to wait a little bit, but with priority access, you can jump on. So this is a good discussion, and it's an important one, I think. The same attendee actually came up with a question, said Google charges GAA about $250 per month. And to be clear, what they're charging there for is the SaaS, is that Spectrum Administration Service. They do it like that. I know that there are 4 SaaS providers, 5 SaaS providers. They charge in different ways. Some of them bundle the EPC in there. Others will sell you equipment and it's bundled in there as well. So that's what that service is for. And the SaaS actually works out the coordination of the frequencies and all the devices. That's what it's doing. So, but you don't have to buy the license. You don't have to pay to use the spectrum. You do have to pay to use a little bit of that equipment. Is what's happening.
Hey, Ian, I think there's one other thing to point out. And if you're looking at an in-building deployment, the power limitations are pretty strict. So if you're in building, you likely have the opportunity to use all 150 megahertz of that spectrum, even in GAA. So I think the PAL auction is going to be primarily, when outdoor deployments come into play. Now I say primarily, that may not be the case in Manhattan and other areas like that, but primarily.
Yeah, I think another aspect to exactly that. I a lot of times say, if you control the real estate,
Right.
You basically have access to 150 megahertz because you will determine who can even be allowed to transmit PAL license in your real estate. So that's actually an opportunity, and you want to kind of put yourself in that position if you are, in real estate. So I think both the power and the fact that you control the real estate, enable you to. And again, if you're a real estate owner or enterprise, you actually might want some of these guys that have a PAL license because they have more of a broader service area of their services, and that, at least in real estate, most probably would increase the value. But you both want to be in control of that, a little bit back to access to data or just monetizing it. So it's pretty interesting how all this is kind of changing how we think about things.
Yep.
So other analogy here, Ian, is if you own if it's a private beach that you own, you can put your beach chairs wherever you want.
Okay, crazy analogies here. All right, we're just about out of time. We do have a couple more questions that came in. I'll make sure I answer those on email to those guys. I know who they are. I can see from the registration list. But we're out of time here. I do want to thank Tom and Jim and Todd here. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about payment options and things like this. We did get into pricing and costs, obviously. If there are any other questions, just let me know. We can get those addressed. But guys, thanks very much. I appreciate the time as always. And just for the audience, this session is being recorded. You will get an email with the details later on of how to access that archive. Share it with your, I would say friends and family, but they may not appreciate that, but colleagues, customers. But gentlemen, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.